let me come back to you because, as part of the China CEO group that you're looking at, what do you think it will take to actually attract large Chinese investment into India? Should the government follow a carrot and stick approach? Should the Indian government follow a carrot and stick approach?
I would think that it will have to be that, but I would focus more on carrot than stick. The reason I'm saying that is that to get the investment into India, the investment has to justify.
Yeah.
Nobody's going to invest because...
Sure, out of the generosity of their heart, yeah.
Which means that you have to create the right kind of atmosphere for Chinese to invest. One of the biggest concerns the Chinese perhaps have today is that opening a new business in India is very difficult. I'm not talking just about the ease of doing business, but a lot about...
But is it specific to the Chinese, or is it investment in India in general?
We in India become used to it, know how to handle it. Yeah. Somebody coming from outside will get bewildered.
Yeah, but it would be the same for an American or a European company, right?
If you want investment to come from China or anywhere else for that matter, we have to do that. We have to create plug-and-play model, as has been talked about in some of the earlier talks, and make it easier for them to come and invest. Other thing for Chinese is the language issue, because still China does not have as many English-speaking people as many other countries do, and therefore to create, to have pool of people who can be Chinese-speaking would help. To create industrial park where Chinese can have their own sort of companies, community, talk to each other and be comfortable. I think just makes it a little easier for them to come in and do business. So that is one part of it, how to make them comfortable. The second part is what are the areas. We need to identify very clearly which areas will be successful for a Chinese business to come into India and invest. That means what is the need in India, what is the gap in India, what is the offering of Chinese. The
gap clearly is on the infrastructure side, but do you believe that Chinese companies will look at Indian infrastructure and put in risk capital, for instance?
I think there we probably have to do a sovereign deal, where some of the money that China wants to invest outside China, they have $3 trillion, I'm told, sitting idle. Not idle, but sitting to invest it. And if some of that can come into India with some kind of a semi-guarantee in Chinese currency for return that's coming in, I think that will be very good for the long term for India in terms of infrastructure investment and for China in terms of finding diversification of where they're going to be investing.
Okay. Professor, let me ask you this, because, there's been a lot of talk on this $46 billion China-Pakistan economic corridor, and it's raised hackles back in India as well. But do you really see any significant infrastructure development, Chinese investment coming into India, apart from what the government is now hoping to do, whether it's metros in various cities or airport development, as some states may be looking at that? But do you really see India and China collaborating significantly, for instance, like we've just seen China and Pakistan do?
There's definitely a desire on the part of Chinese companies. And I think the Chinese infrastructure companies have been very active, actually amongst the most active in India of all the sectors in China. Companies like Shanghai Electric with power supplies, the construction companies with the drilling machines for metro systems and so on. And I think, and you have to remember also that Chinese companies don't have a great deal of experience investing abroad. They are also on a learning curve. In fact, in that respect, I would say that Indian companies probably have far more experience of doing this than the Chinese companies. And we have a center here at CII which studies Chinese companies going abroad. So you have to understand the behavior of the Chinese companies from that perspective. They may tend to be a little risk averse. They may prefer to export from China rather than invest in India. But we have to formulate an industrial policy that's aligned to our interests. The Chinese would not have allowed, have never allowed, opened their doors to imports flooding their country. They've asked the exporters to set up manufacturing facilities in China in the early stages through joint ventures. And now recently they've been allowing in many sectors 100% ownership. So India has to formulate the policies that it needs.
Absolutely, keeping its strategic national interests
in mind. Right? But there is no question that when it comes to infrastructure, China probably provides the best cost effectiveness. If we want to build roads, if we want to build metros.
Yeah.
China has a tremendous amount of experience, and we can achieve that with the lowest investment if we work with China in this area.
Mr. Uppal, energy, and interestingly, we actually had a separate climate change agreement being signed between India and China 24 hours ago when the two leaders met. But in terms of energy, and especially the renewable energy space, there are MOUs being signed for solar power, wind, and so on and so forth. How big an area of opportunity is energy going to be between the two countries in terms of collaboration?
But energy is basically of two types. You have the fossil fuel-based energy and you have the renewables. In the fossil fuel-based systems, China has already played a very big role. I would say that of the total thermal capacity which is installed, the Chinese share is almost like 30%. So they play a big role. And when it comes to renewables, where we have the solar and the wind, I think in solar sector in particular, China has a big role to play. So they have introduced a lot of the low-cost manufacturing of the solar panels and inverters and these kind of products. And I think therefore we could set up a renewable solar energy parks at a very low cost in India if the Chinese come into that market. So there is a big scope for them to sort of play with.
But going back to the point that Professor was making in terms of the policy that India ought to put on the table to align its own national interests, because there are all kinds of fears, and it's not just fears about China. So there needs to perhaps be, you could call it protectionism, I would call it strategic national interest at play when you're talking about policy. What is it that you would like to see the government put in place? Because we're still awaiting the final policy as far as manufacturing is concerned.
I would just like to point out one thing here, that if you look at Chinese exports, they fall in two categories. Number one, exporting the goods. Second is doing the projects. They normally do the projects on an EPC basis. And therefore, there's nothing in between that they do. Because they want to be on top of everything, control everything. Whereas in the case of India, we can't allow that, giving them an EPC job. I think that is what we need to define as to what is it they need to do locally and what is it they can bring from outside. I think that is what the manufacturing policy should address, so that there's a complete clarity and there's no sense of disappointment from either side.
Okay. Amit, let me ask the same question to you. What is it that you would like to see this national manufacturing policy put in place?
I think if you look at India right now, there are certain areas where there is obviously a need for huge investment. There is a lack of attended capital or lack of technology. And there are those sectors which congruently China is a supplier of technology and has the ability to supply capital. So let's look at 2 or 3 sectors. Let's look at rail. High-speed rail is something we've been talking about. Why is there not a case where the Chinese rail company can set up a plant in India? Because India's rail demand is adequate to support such a facility. We're talking to Europeans and Americans to do it. Why not include the Chinese in that? And look at whether it's done in a joint venture with an Indian company or whatever. And then you get the technology and potentially the capital. Look at the electronics sector, which is something which we don't have in India. I'm not talking about software, I'm talking about electronic hardware.
Hardware, absolutely.
And we don't have this. So that's another sector where we need technology and capital.
And a supply chain.
And a supply chain. And these are sectors where if there is a long-term vision, a long-term strategy and an alignment with your potential partners here, and you create a dedicated park or a dedicated, corridor or whatever, and then deploy that, through a long-term framework agreement or something like that, with some amount of sovereign guarantee or sovereign backing or whatever it is. I mean, there's no reason why that can't work.
Okay. Dr. Goenka, let me end by asking you, again, so much talk around this Make in India business, but really until and unless we address the basic issues, logistics, infrastructure, power supply, so on and so forth, can we really aspire to make in India the reality that this government hopes it will be?
Absolutely not. There are some very basic things that perhaps is not...
So Make in India, a 5-year plan, I mean, the reality of what the government is talking about, perhaps we could see that translate into action 5 years down the line.
I sometimes feel there's too much focus on, let's say, NIMS and not enough focus on how do we get the investment that's already on the ground to start working. And that requires all these basic things, infrastructure, power, labor laws, and so on and so forth, which is making it very difficult for Indian manufacturing to be competitive today. The fact is that Indian manufacturing is not competitive if you go outside India. Only in India we are able to compete. There's one more thing that I want to add here, which is very important, I believe, that when we compare Make in India to Made in China, one area where India still has an edge outside India is in the brand. Indian brand still is seen somewhat higher than Chinese brand. It won't last very long unless we put tremendous effort in ensuring that a brand goes further. And we have to keep that advantage. So advantage of IPR, advantage of manufacturing quality, which we have to develop, and advantage of brand. If we can combine the three together.
And the private entrepreneurial space, which is clearly the big advantage that India enjoys.
Right. The Indian private entrepreneurs, the industrial groups that we have in India, a lot stronger, very high aspiration level, very good management talent that we have available. We have to leverage all of these things and combine with basics of making our manufacturing strong to win this slogan of Make in India.
Well, there's going to be a lot of road that we are going to have to walk before we can win that slogan of Make in India. But Amit, Kalyani, Pawan, Goenka, Professor and Ravi, we'll appreciate you joining us here on this special CNBC TV 18 conversation. Let's hope that both countries will find answers to some of the problems that we've addressed, and specifically India will take back lessons from Made in China, not the mistakes that Made in China has, and there's plenty of those, but take back some of the lessons and incorporate them into the Make in India policy. Thanks very much for joining us here on the CNBC TV 18 special. From all of us here, from the Engaging the Dragon team, goodbye and many thanks for watching.